Sorry about for the interruption, you guys. I was reviewing A Land in Two Halves by Joe Bennett, and we were on Queenstown. So Joe travels to Queenstown, sees a lot of the adventure capital of the world things. He does say that the town is laid out very prettily. It's very beautiful the way that it's laid out. He said it feels like a Swiss chalet. This is just partially because of the natural parameters of the town itself. There's very little flat land, and it's all pushed up kind of against the mountains, between the mountains and this alpine lake in the Great Southern Alps. He did say that very few locals live there. They've been pushed out in terms of real estate, or if they are locals, they're very wealthy locals. Most people drive in to work in Queenstown. Yeah, so he also said that the Remarkables, the mountains over the top, were very beautiful, but it was mostly just a tourist attraction. So after Queenstown, he goes up to Wanaka, which is kind of the new Queenstown. It's not quite as pushed together as Queenstown is, but as with any place that becomes popular, the locals or the tourists start wandering about, seeing what's around, and Wanaka is fairly close, has a similar alpine feel. Kind of like Teananu is kind of open on its end of it, but on the other side is glorious mountains. But unlike Teananu, which is mostly still just a kind of farming community with some tourism, Wanaka's kind of become a true tourist area. And then he does like the big change. He goes over the Hast Pass. Yes, Haast, Hast Pass, which takes him to the west coast. Now he's out of Ontonago, I believe, and in the Westlands. And this area has some tourism, but it tends to be more like bus tourism. It tends to not be as high end. It tends to be, yeah. And it's kind of the author described it as a place that's very feral. It's one of the least populated, like density populated areas in all of New Zealand. It's, yeah, I've actually been there too. It's very feral. That's a good way of putting it. But between the Franz Josef Glacier, which he mentions in the book, and the Fox Glacier, as well as kind of the beautiful rivuleted streams that come straight off the mountains and have a very short life before they flow into the sea, to the point where they're still very cold. Many of them being glacier melt streams, these ribbon streams, as well as the sort of gray coast. Even the towns in the west coast of New Zealand don't try to play on their coast. You know, the coast is oftentimes a tourist attraction area, I guess you call it, you know, like any like Miami Beach or Bondi Beach or whatever. But it's so gray and kind of perpetually cold, or cool, not really like above freezing, but just barely above freezing, that the towns kind of face inland away from the surf. And actually in, where was it? I think it was Hokitika. That's a Maori word. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. They've actually had to build huge tidal walls because occasionally during king tides, or I guess during tsunamis, I don't know, the town floods and it destroys the entire town. So the sea is not seen as something of somewhere to go, but actually something to be feared. And when Joe goes out on the sea, mostly what he sees is seagulls and I think maybe like a few seals that clearly it's their beach. It's not a beach for man. But the main tourist attraction is Franz Josef, which he climbs up on, again, has sort of a cynical point of view of, but kind of enjoys. He kind of talks a little bit about thinking about like the rain coming down 10,000 years ago at the top of the glacier, and then through just well, 10,000 might have been pulled out of my ass a little bit, but a long time at the top of the glacier, more snowflakes, and then just years upon years upon years, lifetimes, in order to get from the top of the glacier to the bottom of the glacier where it melts out and becomes one of these rivuleted streams. Um, I talked a little bit Hokitika. Oh yeah, the big industry of the West Coast was it was like a boom and bust economy because it was mainly built around mineral prospecting and even more so timber, both of which have had the kibosh put on them by environmentalist concerns, and they're legit concerns, but it's made the place seem kind of abandoned. I think there are numerous towns in the West Coast, particularly Hokitika, still pronouncing that wrong, that were larger maybe like 100 or 150 years ago than they are today. So you have kind of, a lot of that stuff's been razzed, but it just has kind of an abandoned feel to it. Goes up to Greymouth, and he describes it exactly as Greymouth. Kind of, again, sort of not like depressed, like the economy's just like people are starving, but just where there isn't a lot going on, a lot of people are moving out, that kind of thing. He does like the train station in the middle of the city, which he says has kind of a Victorian train station vibe to it, but is, because the town is small, it's relatively small and doesn't have a lot of redeeming value. After getting thumbs up hitchhiking his way from pretty much the whole coast, this is the first time that he does not hitchhike, when he goes from Greymouth back to through the pass to Christchurch. First, he rides a Greyhound bus, which he laments and says train travel is way better. Mentions Paul Thoreau on train travel, but nobody ever writes romantic tales about taking the bus. It kind of talks about kind of the eclectic characters that ride the bus. They tend to be tourists that kind of like out of the way travel, which is kind of a cool thing. But more common is kind of just locals that don't have cars, or it's just kind of a eclectic, truly weird mix. Makes it back to Christchurch, and then we're on to the North Island. Let me get to the right page for the map here. Yeah, that'll be good enough. So he starts in, oddly enough, of all places, Palmerston North. He doesn't start in Wellington. He doesn't start in Auckland. He starts in kind of this random city in the middle of nowhere. Kind of talks about between Palmerston North, which he says has a terrible municipal building, which I mentioned earlier, and Napier, about the Danish men that came in and cut this road in like the 1960s. Now, you think of frontier as the 1800s, but in New Zealand and I guess Australia too, there are many frontiers that are like within the last 70 years or whatever. So really in Australia there's probably still frontiers to be cut. Goes to Napier, talks about the Art Deco buildings there, how the city was destroyed and then rebuilt. Laments the motel that he stays at, which he says it seems like every building in the whole area was Art Deco, except for the motel he stayed at, which was just a garbage bin. I'm gonna have to do this in 3 parts because I'm getting interrupted again. So see you guys, bye.